when I'm not reporting on the latest tournament games or indeed World Championship games, I sometimes like to go back and look at some classics from chess history, and I've had quite a few requests to look at some past games of Vishy Anand. So I'm happy to do that, and I'm going to take you back to New York 1995 and his first World Championship match against the reigning world champion Garry Kasparov. I was actually there as a commentator, and it was a fantastic media event, as you can imagine, in New York. The match was held at the top of one of the Twin Towers, the World Trade Center. Incredible to think. And, well, there's a huge hype surrounding the match. But the first 8 games were drawn, and there was a very vociferous New York crowd in attendance who clearly weren't happy with the, well, slightly peaceful games. In fact, those first 8 games were very tense indeed. The players were just kind of sounding each other out. But as is actually quite normal for a World Championship match. Let's see what happened in game 9. Anand had the white pieces, plays e4, and Kasparov opens with his customary Sicilian defence, and they'd actually played exactly this opening in those first 8 games, in 4 of those first 8 games. The Najdorf from Kasparov, his favourite opening against e4. And now bishop e2 from Anand. So very solid, very classical, very typical of Anand. And now Kasparov played this pawn move to e6. Of course, you can play the pawn to e5 here. I prefer to fix the structure with e5, but in his career, generally Kasparov liked to go for these so-called Scheveningen structures, keeping the pawn formation in the centre quite fluid. So let's go on. We had castles from Anand, everything absolutely normal so far. And a4 from Anand, preventing Kasparov breaking free with b5. So standard development so far. And let's go on. Everything absolutely normal. And this is very classical chess from Anand, very typical of his style. Now, here's a mysterious move from Kasparov. The rook comes to e8. Now, why does he do this? Well, very often this e-file can open. For example, if sometimes white plays f5 or black actually breaks with e5, and that rook is lined up against these bishops and, of course, the e-pawn. So it looks very deep indeed, but actually a very standard move. Preparing to play e5. And bishop f3. Well, this is a pretty standard move, but in 3 of their previous encounters in the match, Anand had actually tried bishop d3, and got some interesting positions, but Kasparov had shown how he could neutralise that move. So this was a new move for this match at any rate. In fact, this move had been played several times by Karpov against Kasparov in their 1985 match. In fact, the decisive last game in that 85 match between Karpov and Kasparov went rook b8 and led to very sharp positions indeed. Let me just play through a few more moves of this game. Karpov played with g4 and g5, forcing the knight back, and Karpov really went for it against Kasparov in that final game. It was a fantastic game. But of course, when you advance the g-pawn, it looks very impressive, but you have to realise that this opens the diagonal towards the king in the corner. And Kasparov eventually launched a decisive counterattack. But that's a very sharp way to play. But it's interesting that here, Kasparov declined to play in that very sharp way and instead preferred to develop. Now, the bishop comes here. The idea is that you want to exchange knights and play the bishop out to neutralise this bishop. So Anand drops the knight back. Now, one could play in a similar way to that Karpov-Kasparov match with b6, and again g4 would come, The bishop has to drop back to make room for the knight. And, well, this has been tested in the past decade or so quite a few times. And at the moment, white is faring very well in this position, actually. For example, well, Luc van Velde, the Dutch player, is quite an expert in this line with black, but he's suffered quite a few losses. That's for you to investigate for another time. But as I said, Kasparov didn't go for that, but instead played to simplify the position on the queen side. It's far more positional, actually. Now, it means that after these exchanges, it's much less likely that white is going to go for this g4, g5. It's just not appropriate. The bishop will come here very quickly, and white's attack just won't be as strong when after these exchanges with the queen active and the bishop active. And somehow this suits Anand's style as well. He played in a very classical way, not with g4, g5, but he's looking to keep control in the centre and on the queen side as well. And this line had previously been tested by the Dutch player John van der Wiel in several games. And Anand played a recommendation of his. So you can see how deep the preparation for both sides is. This move, rook fd1, is a recommendation by van der Wiel. And, well, it seems very sensible, just keeping pressure on the d file here. Kasparov played the bishop out. That, of course, is the intention with playing the bishop to d7, so it neutralises this powerful bishop on f3. And now, if white does nothing, then black is going to break with d5 very successfully, actually, and it's going to be very hard with the queen on d3 to control black's counterplay in the middle. So Anand has to react very quickly here, which he did with clearly a prepared move, this pawn move to b4. Now this, to me, looks a little bit unusual, because very often if you play this move in the Sicilian, everything on the c file is weaker, this knight on c3 and pawn on c2. Here you can get away with it because this bishop rather blocks the counterplay on the c file, but also we're going to use the fact that this bishop is here to gain time. By the way, I should mention that pawn cannot be taken because actually the queen would be attacked and trapped. Queen here, queen gets trapped, or queen back to a5, and bishop b6 traps the queen. So the queen had to retreat, the pawn advances. Okay, we can see white can get away with this because he's gaining time. If this is taken, then white gains a fantastic square for one of these pieces on b6. So the bishop retreats, and now this is actually the first new move of the game. Previously, knight had gone back to e2 in well, a game between another two Dutch players. But this is an excellent new move from Anand. I'm sure this would have been preparation. So move 19 and still in preparation. Basically, white is playing on the queen side. You can see all his pieces here are directed towards the queen side, and now the rook occupies an open file here. So Kasparov exchanged. There was a threat possibly to take there. And pawn takes is possible, but Anand played knight takes, and this looks very sensible. Now here, big decision from Kasparov. Do you exchange off bishop for knight, or do you move your queen out again? Kasparov declined not to do this, and I'm sure he was worried about preparation here. And there are some very complicated variations after knight takes d6. Must have been preparation, which lead to long forcing variations. Instead, I think understandably, Kasparov preferred clarity and exchanged off that bishop for a knight. But in exchanging off bishop for knight, it means that this bishop in particular is a very dangerous piece, and now there is a clear threat for white to play the pawn to e5, opening up that line of the bishop to the pawn here, and that would be almost lost. So Kasparov has to play the pawn forward. But you can see how Anand is starting to gain control here. The bishop comes in. Now the queen would like to come up to this square, but that pawn advance to c5 undermining black's centre is just too powerful, for example, here. And now you can see that knight is completely trapped. That bishop does a very good job of controlling these squares, and of course the rook controls that square there. So the queen had to retreat. Anand gaining control here. You can see he started a real clamp on the queen side. That bishop does a superb job of covering the square here, preventing black from challenging on the d file. So black just has to stay passive for the time being. Nice move from Anand, just taking control of this square, giving the king an escape square. And now Anand slammed the rook in on d5. After just a couple of minutes thought, he was moving very quickly here, his kind of position. And after the game, Anand said, I wasn't daring Kasparov to take my rook with the knight. I was begging him. Well, we'll see what happens in a second after Kasparov did take it. It's very strange. Kasparov took that rook after just, well, a few moments thought actually. The position might not be so bad for black if he just sits there. Maybe plays here. Even g5 is an interesting move to attack on the king side, but I think you can just sit there with black. Now, Kasparov thought he was strategically lost here, but it's not so clear. It's not so easy to see how white is going to break through. He does have a very imposing position, real control on the queen side, but not easy to break through. Now, maybe you exchange rooks here and hope to use your queen to attack on the queen side, but it's not so simple. But incredibly, Kasparov took that rook, and after this, although Anand is the exchange down, he has just these pawns storming through the middle of the board, and this is so difficult for black. Now, I think the thing is, it's a very easy position for white to play because you have just one strategic aim, queen the pawns. There are a few subtleties along the way. That is a very good move from Anand, because the queen not only attacks the pawn here, but it defends on the king side as well, and so that really neutralises black's any potential kingside counterplay. So, although the rook looks very passive, basically the queen is going to scoop up everything on the queen side. So let's see what happened. Anand in complete control here, just scooping up pawns. Now, there is a threat there, of course, to play rook takes pawn and mate. But after this move, Kasparov resigned. Now, what's so great about this? Well, first of all, it protects the pawn, it prevents the mate, it threatens a rook. But basically, yeah, just defends against the threats, and now white is threatening to take the rook, but also just to push the pawn. So let's see what happens if the rook moves. Well, just advancing the pawn is very simple indeed. You don't actually need to take that rook. So you're threatening to take the rook or queen. This looks like it could be a very worrying move, threatening some kind of discovered check here. But in fact, white can simply take the rook in the corner. And there is no decent discovered check. The rook can go back. The king just moves back. And there is no real threat. So white is simply a whole rook up here. So after king h2, as I said, Kasparov resigned the game. So Kasparov was the first to strike. He went one up after 9 games. Well, Anand, as you can imagine after that, was absolutely ecstatic. He hadn't beaten Kasparov for some time in tournament games, and now he went one ahead. But we'll see what happened in game 10 of this match in my next clip. Thanks for watching.